Yeah, when we're talking about scholasticism, and I recognize too among Lutherans that the use of this phrase itself will be very controversial. Actually, both words, probably Protestant and the word scholastic,
Fair.
um, because there are many Lutherans who say we're not Protestants. So let me kind of define what I'm talking about, and then people also, I've gotten comments of why are you calling this scholasticism? Wasn't Luther? Doesn't he have those treatise against scholastic theology? Like what are you talking about? So let me kind of frame what Protestant scholasticism is in a broad sense. So in a historical sense, Protestant scholasticism refers to a particular movement within 17th century theology. And that particular movement expands beyond just the Lutheran tradition, but includes both the Reformed and the Lutheran tradition, and even broader than that as well. You have some Arminian scholastics who are really kind of coming out of the Reformed tradition, and then you have Anglicans as well who are kind of part of the Reformed tradition but kind of not, and then so it's a broad movement is the point. And this is an era in doing theology, really, that is the 17th century, essentially, is what you're talking about. But this is an area of theology where the confessions of the faith have been written, and, well, at least the Lutheran confessions have been written, and the Dutch Reformed confessions have been written, because, Westminster is 1646 and 1648. But you're talking about this era now of taking the theology of the Reformers and developing it more systematically, and putting it into some structures that do resemble what were the structures of the medieval period. Because the medieval period was an era of taking the theology of the fathers and developed theology and now putting it into a more complex system or a more coherent system, right? Not just for the sake of complexity. Well, sometimes with the medievals, but
Yeah.
it shouldn't be just for the sake of complexity or confusion, but it sometimes does get that way. But the same kind of thing happened after the Reformation. So now we've got this theology, but now what we want to do with that Reformation theology is define it more specifically, spend more time going into Scripture and saying, how can we defend these views more particularly? And also, there's a polemical element to that theology, which is now that we have this developed theology and these developed traditions, how is it that we know that we're right? So we have polemical writings. So it's the theology of the Reformation, but it's more developed. And that doesn't mean that there's a fundamental kind of divergence theologically between what is the theology of a Luther, Melanchthon, and then what you find in a Gerhard, for example. I think that theologically, they're basically coming at their theology with the same convictions, but one is presented more systematically and is more developed in terms of the terms that are used. There's more language of Aristotelian categories, like we have the language of the causes, and that the development of that language of causality, that's in Melanchthon. I mean, this is not just post-Reformation bringing Aristotle into theology, but it's a recognition that, now that we kind of have purged our theology from those bad developments of the medieval period, we can use some of the elements of that method that was used in the Middle Ages. And what some modern critics are going to say is, well, they just kind of went back to that period beforehand and kind of undid the Reformation, which is really not an accurate reading at all. There are strong differences between the Lutheran scholastics and the Reformed scholastics and the medievals. You're not going to find the kind of speculation in the Lutheran scholastics that you find in some of the medievals about, hierarchies of angels and those kinds of things. And you're going to find a much more kind of Bible-centered theology than you find there. I mean, they're certainly going to use, the church fathers and the traditions of the church are going to speak about those things, but you see the centrality of Scripture and the conviction that Scripture is the ultimate foundation and source of truth that you don't find to that extent in the previous writers. So you have both continuity and discontinuity there. But basically, this is a very long-winded answer, but when we're talking about the 17th century, when we're talking about Protestant scholasticism, we're talking about the movements of the 17th century that is used to define a historical period of development of theology in the post-Reformation era. And my basic argument is that the way that theology developed in that era was not fundamentally opposed to the Reformation. In fact, it's a development of the Reformation in a positive way. And today, when we do theology, we need not set that idea up over against Luther's theology of these, as if these two are opposing things. But I think we can build on the foundation of what those 17th century authors were doing not to just not just in the sense that we completely repeat everything they said without any new developments or applying them to today's ideas, but they're a foundation that we can and I think should stand on as we do theology today.